Marcus Jensen sat quietly in his first-class seat, looking out the window as other passengers boarded the plane. At 42 years old, he had built his company, Ecotech Solutions, from nothing into a global powerhouse worth billions. Today, like most days when he traveled, he wore simple clothes, worn jeans, a plain blue button-down shirt, and comfortable sneakers. He never liked to show off his wealth. Flight 372 from New York to San Francisco was almost full when Heather Dawson began her pre-flight checks in the first-class cabin. She had been working as a flight attendant for Liberty Airlines for 15 years and prided herself on knowing the type of people who belonged in first class. When she spotted Marcus, her smile dropped slightly. She looked him up and down, noticing his casual clothes and the way he kept to himself. Without checking her passenger list, she approached him with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," Heather said sharply. "I think you might be in the wrong section. May I see your boarding pass?" Marcus looked up, used to this kind of treatment. He reached into his pocket and handed her his ticket without a word. Heather's eyes widened slightly when she saw the seat assignment, but she quickly composed herself. "Very well," she said, handing the ticket back. "Please make sure your seatbelt is fastened for takeoff." She moved on quickly, but Marcus noticed how warmly she greeted the older white couple across the aisle. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, so lovely to see you again. Can I get you anything before we take off? Perhaps some champagne?" Marcus sighed and returned to looking out the window. In the reflection, he could see how the Petersons glanced at him with curiosity, probably wondering how someone who looked like him could afford first class. The plane took off smoothly, and once they reached cruising altitude, Heather began serving drinks. She worked her way through the cabin, chatting pleasantly with each passenger. When she reached Marcus, her demeanor changed. "Something to drink?" she asked flatly. "Coffee, please." "Black," Marcus replied politely. Heather nodded and moved on without another word. 10 minutes later, she had served everyone else. Marcus's coffee was nowhere to be seen. He pressed the call button. When Heather returned, her face showed clear annoyance. "Yes?" "I'm sorry, but I ordered coffee earlier," Marcus said. "I'll get to it when I can," she replied. "I'm very busy right now." Marcus glanced around the cabin. Everyone else had been served, and Heather was actually just chatting with another flight attendant by the galley. An hour into the flight, Marcus still had no coffee, and now he was thirsty. He pressed the call button again. This time, Heather took even longer to respond. "What is it now?" she asked, making no effort to hide her irritation. "May I please have some water?" Marcus asked, maintaining his composure. "Fine," she said. She returned with a plastic cup half filled with water, practically dropping it on his tray table, causing some to spill. The businessman sitting next to Marcus, who had been watching these interactions with growing discomfort, leaned over. "That's not right, how she's treating you," he whispered. Marcus just nodded. "It happens more often than you'd think." The man looked troubled by this. "I'm David, by the way," he said, extending his hand. "Marcus," he replied, shaking it. What neither of them knew was that Heather's behavior was about to get much worse, and that this ordinary flight would soon turn into a national news story that would change many lives forever. The flight continued for another hour with Heather clearly avoiding Marcus's section. When she did pass by, she would smile and chat with other passengers but completely ignore him. Marcus pulled out his laptop and tried to focus on work, but he couldn't help noticing the different treatment. David, the businessman sitting next to Marcus, became increasingly uncomfortable watching the situation unfold. He was the CEO of a mid-sized construction company and had been on hundreds of flights, but he had never seen such obvious poor service. "Do you want me to say something?" David asked quietly. Marcus shook his head. "It's okay. I've dealt with this before." What Marcus didn't mention was that he had faced this kind of discrimination throughout his journey to success. Even now, as the owner of a company valued at $8.7 billion, people still judged him by his skin color before knowing anything about him. Halfway through the flight, the meal service began. Heather moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, serving each passenger with a smile and asking if they needed anything else. When she reached Marcus, she practically threw the meal tray on his table. "Here," she said flatly, not even making eye contact. Marcus noticed his meal looked different from what others were getting. while other passengers received hot meals with proper silverware, as looked hastily put together with plastic utensils. "Excuse me," Marcus said politely. "I think there might be a mistake with my meal." Heather turned back with an exaggerated sigh. "What's the problem now?" "My meal seems different from what everyone else received," Marcus explained calmly. "We ran out of the regular first-class meals," Heather said dismissively. "This is what's left." David, who had been listening, spoke up. "That's strange. I just saw you serve the same meal to the gentleman across the aisle, and there are more meals on your cart." Heather's face reddened. "I don't appreciate being questioned about how I do my job," she snapped. She stormed off without addressing the issue. An older woman sitting across the aisle leaned over. "I'm so sorry, dear," she whispered to Marcus. "That's simply unacceptable." Marcus thanked her with a nod but said nothing. He was used to keeping his cool in difficult situations. It was one of the qualities that had helped him build his company from scratch. A few minutes later, the head flight attendant, Patricia, came to Marcus's seat. She had a warm smile and a proper meal tray. "Sir, I apologize for the mix-up," she said kindly. "Please accept this meal and our apologies." After Patricia left, Marcus noticed Heather glaring at him from the galley. She clearly wasn't happy that he had received proper service. For the next hour, she whispered to another flight attendant while looking in his direction and making what appeared to be mocking gestures. As the flight progressed, more passengers began to notice Heather's behavior. Some exchanged concerned glances, while others openly frowned at her treatment of Marcus. David pulled out his phone and discreetly started recording some of the interactions. Just in case, he explained quietly to Marcus, "This isn't right." Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant confirming his meeting with airline executives the following week. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was scheduled to discuss a potential partnership worth millions between his company and this very airline, and here he was being treated like an unwelcome intruder in first class. Little did Heather know that the man she was discriminating against could buy the entire airline if he wanted to. And the worst of her behavior was yet to come. As the flight entered its third hour, the tension in the first-class cabin grew thicker. Several passengers had noticed Heather's treatment of Marcus and were watching the situation with uncomfortable expressions. Marcus remained focused on his laptop, working on a presentation for the next day's meeting with a major environmental organization. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing the seatbelt sign to flash on. Heather moved through the cabin, checking that everyone was following the safety protocol. She stopped next to each passenger, offering a friendly reminder to fasten their seatbelts. When she reached Marcus, her demeanor changed completely. "Seatbelt," she commanded sharply, not even looking at him directly. Marcus glanced down at his waist where his seatbelt was already securely fastened, as it had been the entire flight. He simply nodded and returned to his work. "Did you hear me?" Heather pressed, her voice rising. "I said fasten your seatbelt." "It is fastened," Marcus replied calmly, gesturing to the buckled belt across his lap. Heather's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me," she muttered, just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat next to Marcus. "He's had his seatbelt on the whole time," he said to Heather. She shot David an icy look before moving on. The turbulence increased, and Heather grabbed onto the seats to steady herself as she made her way back to the galley. When the air smoothed out and the seatbelt sign turned off, Marcus realized his water glass was empty again. He had been deliberately drinking less to avoid having to interact with Heather, but his throat was dry from the cabin air. After hesitating for a moment, he pressed the call button. 3 minutes passed, then 5. Finally, after nearly 8 minutes, Heather appeared with clear annoyance on her face. "What is it now?" she asked, not attempting to hide her irritation. "May I please have some water?" Marcus asked politely. Heather looked at him as if he had asked for something completely unreasonable. "I'll bring it when I have time," she said, reaching up to turn off the call button. "Excuse me," Marcus said, "but I've been waiting quite a while for water throughout this flight. Everyone else seems to be getting prompt service." Something in Heather seemed to snap. Her face flushed red, and she leaned down closer to Marcus. "Listen," she hissed in a low voice, "I know people like you think you can demand special treatment, but you don't belong in this section, and we both know it." The cabin went quiet. Several passengers gasped. Marcus stared at her, stunned by the openly racist comment. "I'm just asking for water, like any other passenger," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady despite his shock. "You're being disruptive," Heather said loudly, clearly wanting others to hear. "I've been patient with you, but you're crossing a line." "I don't think asking for water is crossing any line," Marcus responded. What happened next shocked everyone in the cabin. Heather's right hand swung forward in a quick, sharp motion, connecting with Marcus's cheek with a loud smack. The slap echoed through the quiet cabin. Every passenger in first class froze in disbelief. Even Heather seemed surprised by her own action, her hand still suspended in the air. Marcus slowly raised his hand to his stinging cheek, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. In his 20 years of business, through countless meetings, negotiations, and business trips, he had never been physically assaulted. "I want your full name and employee number," Marcus said quietly. Patricia, the head flight attendant, rushed over, having heard the commotion. "What's happening here?" she asked, looking between Heather and Marcus. "She just slapped this passenger," David exclaimed, holding up his phone. "I got it all on video." The realization of what she had done finally seemed to dawn on Heather's face, but it was too late. What she didn't know was that she had just slapped one of the most powerful businessmen in America, a man whose next decision would change her life forever. The first-class cabin erupted into chaos. Patricia, the head flight attendant, stood frozen in shock as passengers began talking all at once. Some were standing up to get a better view. Others were pulling out their phones to record what was happening. "She hit him," an elderly woman exclaimed. "I saw it with my own eyes." Completely unprovoked, added another passenger. Marcus remained seated, one hand still touching his cheek where Heather had slapped him. Despite the commotion around him, he stayed remarkably calm. Years of handling difficult business situations had taught him to keep his emotions in check, even in extreme circumstances. Heather's face had gone pale. She took a step back, suddenly aware of all the eyes on her. "He was threatening me," she stammered, looking around desperately for support. "He was being aggressive." "That's absolutely not true," David said firmly, still holding up his phone. "I recorded everything. He simply asked for water, politely, multiple times." Patricia quickly stepped between Heather and Marcus. "Ms. Dawson, please go to the back galley immediately," she ordered in a hushed but firm tone. Turning to Marcus, her voice softened with genuine concern. "Sir, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Marcus replied quietly, "but I would like the captain to be informed about what just happened." Patricia nodded. "Of course. I'll speak to him right away and file a formal incident report. This behavior is completely unacceptable." As Patricia hurried toward the cockpit, the plane's intercom crackled to life. "This is your captain speaking. We're beginning our initial descent into San Francisco. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Heather retreated to the back of the plane, where she was met by two other flight attendants. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones, occasionally glancing toward the first-class cabin. A young flight attendant named Michael stepped in to take over Heather's duties. He approached Marcus with a glass of water and a first aid kit. "Sir, is there anything I can do for you?" "Just the water is fine, thank you," Marcus replied. Several passengers leaned across the aisle to offer their support. "We all saw what happened," a businessman in a gray suit said. "Completely unacceptable. We'll back you up if you need witnesses." Marcus thanked them with a nod but said little. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to his lawyer, briefly explaining the situation. Then he opened his contacts and scrolled to a name: Jessica Torres, SVP of Corporate Relations at Liberty Airlines. They were scheduled to meet the following day to discuss a potential partnership for sustainable fuel initiatives worth millions. The remainder of the flight passed in uncomfortable tension. Patricia returned to inform Marcus that the captain had radioed ahead, and airline representatives would be meeting the plane upon arrival. As the plane began its final approach to San Francisco International Airport, Marcus looked out the window at the city where he had built his headquarters. Ecotech Solutions employed over 5,000 people and had revolutionized solar energy technology. The company's market value had just crossed $8.7 billion last quarter. No one on the plane, least of all Heather, had any idea who he really was. Marcus had always preferred to keep a low profile, rarely appearing in the press and turning down most interview requests. His focus had been on building his company, not becoming a celebrity CEO. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway. As it taxied toward the gate, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at San Francisco International Airport. Local time is 2:45 p.m. Please remain seated until we reach the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Also, I must ask all passengers in first class to remain seated after arrival. We have a situation that requires attention from our ground staff." Looking out the window, Marcus could see 3 people in Liberty Airlines uniforms waiting by the gate, along with 2 airport police officers. His phone buzzed with an incoming message from Jessica Torres. "Marcus, just heard about an incident on your flight. Are you okay? Call me ASAP." The plane came to a stop, and reality was about to hit Heather Dawson full force. The plane door opened, and the waiting airline officials boarded quickly. Leading them was a tall woman in a sharp navy suit with the Liberty Airlines logo pin gleaming on her lapel. She spoke briefly with the captain before making her way to the first-class cabin. The other passengers watched intently as she approached Marcus's seat. "Sir, I'm Laura Chen, Customer Relations Manager for Liberty Airlines at SFO," she said professionally. "I understand there was an incident during your flight. We take these matters extremely seriously." Marcus nodded. "Yes, there was. One of your flight attendants struck me across the face after I requested water." Laura's face showed genuine shock despite clearly having been briefed. "That is completely unacceptable. We would like to take your statement in our private lounge, if that's agreeable to you." "I have it all on video," David volunteered, holding up his phone. "That would be extremely helpful, sir," Laura said. "Would you be willing to share that with us as well?" David nodded firmly. "Absolutely." At the back of the first-class cabin, Heather stood with Patricia and one of the airline officials. Her face was pale, and she kept shaking her head, speaking rapidly. The airport police officers waited nearby, their expressions serious. "All other passengers may now deplane," Laura announced. "We apologize for the delay and thank you for your patience." As people filed past Marcus, many gave him sympathetic looks or quiet words of support. Several offered their contact information as witnesses. The elderly woman across the aisle patted his shoulder gently. "You handled that with such dignity, young man," she said. "Not many would have stayed so calm." Once the other passengers had left, Laura turned back to Marcus. "Sir, if you'll follow me, we can speak privately in our executive lounge." Marcus gathered his things and followed her off the plane. As they walked through the jet bridge, he noticed David waiting for them, along with the airport police and another airline official escorting Heather, who kept her eyes down. In the terminal, a small crowd had gathered. Someone must have texted or called ahead about the incident. Several people were filming with their phones. "Mr. Jensen?" a surprised voice called out. Marcus turned to see Raj Patel, one of his company's senior engineers who happened to be at the airport for another flight. "Mr. Jensen, is everything okay?" Raj asked, looking confused at the sight of his boss walking with airline officials and police. Laura Chen's eyes widened at the name. "Jensen?" "Marcus Jensen of Ecotech Solutions." Marcus nodded simply. Laura's professional composure slipped for just a moment. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You're our meeting tomorrow about the Sustainable Fuel Partnership." Behind them, one of the other airline officials had clearly overheard. He whispered urgently to Heather, whose head snapped up, her face draining of what little color remained. "Marcus Jensen," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "The Ecotech billionaire?" For the first time, Marcus addressed her directly. "Yes, but that shouldn't matter. No passenger deserves to be treated the way you treated me today." The small crowd in the terminal began to buzz as people recognized Marcus's name. Someone shouted, "That's Marcus Jensen," and suddenly phones were being pointed in their direction. Laura quickly regained her composure. "Let's continue this conversation in private, please," she said, guiding Marcus toward a side door marked staff only. Inside a quiet hallway, away from the public area, Laura turned to Marcus. "Mr. Jensen, on behalf of Liberty Airlines, I want to offer our most sincere apologies. What happened today is absolutely inexcusable." Marcus looked at her calmly. "I appreciate that, Ms. Chen, but I'm concerned that your apology seems more urgent now that you know who I am. Every passenger deserves respectful treatment, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Laura had the grace to look embarrassed. You're absolutely right, Mr. Jensen. I believe you have my number from our meeting arrangements, Marcus continued. I'd like to reschedule our discussion for later this week, but first I need to make a few calls. As Marcus walked away toward the private lounge, he pulled out his phone and called his head of public relations. What had happened today wasn't just about him. It was about a problem much bigger than one flight attendant or one airline, and he was now in a position to do something about it. By midnight, the video had exploded across social media. David's recording showed everything clearly. Marcus politely asking for water, Heather's rude response, and then the shocking moment of the slap. The hashtag flying while black was trending nationwide, and Marcus Jensen's name was suddenly on everyone's lips. In his downtown San Francisco penthouse, Marcus sat with his core team, Amara his PR director, Trevor his chief legal counsel, and Jessica his longtime friend and business advisor. The four of them watched the news coverage on a large wall-mounted screen. Liberty Airlines flight attendant suspended after assaulting tech billionaire. Read the headline across the bottom of the screen. Turn it off, Marcus said quietly. Trevor hit the remote, and the room fell silent. The airline's CEO has called 3 times, Amara said, checking her phone. They're in full crisis mode. They're offering a private apology, a lifetime of free flights, and they want to make a substantial donation to a charity of your choice. Marcus shook his head. This isn't about free flights or donations. It's about something much bigger. You should know, Trevor added, that we have a very strong case if you want to sue. The video evidence is clear, there are multiple witnesses, and the damages to both you personally and potentially to your reputation. I don't want to sue them, Marcus interrupted. The 3 others exchanged surprised glances. Marcus, Jessica said carefully, what Heather Dawson did was assault. It was racist and completely unacceptable. There should be consequences. I agree there should be consequences, Marcus replied, but not the kind you're thinking of. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. For a moment, he was quiet, gathering his thoughts. When I started Ecotech, he finally said, nobody believed a black kid from Oakland could build a billion-dollar clean energy company. Every step of the way, I faced people like Heather, people who judged me based on my skin color before they knew anything about me. He turned back to face his team. What happened today has been happening to people who look like me for generations. The only difference is that I have the resources and platform to do something about it. What are you thinking? Amara asked. Marcus smiled slightly, something unexpected. The next morning, Marcus walked into Liberty Airlines headquarters in Dallas. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw him. Within minutes, he was escorted to the CEO's office on the top floor. Richard Wilson, Liberty's CEO for the past 8 years, stood up quickly as Marcus entered. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a nervously extended hand. Mr. Jensen, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are about what happened. It's completely unacceptable, and I want to assure you that Ms. Dawson has been terminated effective immediately. Marcus shook his hand but didn't sit down. I'm not here to accept apologies, Mr. Wilson. I'm here to propose a solution. He placed a folder on the desk. This is a proposal for a comprehensive anti-racism training program for your entire staff, not just flight attendants, but everyone from baggage handlers to pilots to executives. Wilson looked surprised. We already have diversity training. Clearly, it's not working, Marcus interrupted. What I'm proposing is different. It's not just a one-day seminar that people sit through and forget. It's an ongoing program with measurable outcomes, regular assessment, and real accountability. He opened the folder and pointed to the budget page. My foundation will cover half the cost. Liberty Airlines will cover the other half, and I want Heather Dawson to be part of it. Wilson's eyebrows shot up. Ms. Dawson? But she's been terminated. Unterminate her, Marcus said firmly. Firing her doesn't solve the problem. It just moves it somewhere else. I want her to learn from this, to change, and to help others change too. Wilson stared at Marcus, clearly trying to process what he was hearing. This is not what I expected. I know, Marcus replied. That's the point. What happened yesterday was terrible, but it gives us an opportunity to create real change. The question is whether Liberty Airlines wants to be part of that change or not. After a moment of silence, Wilson slowly nodded. I'd like to hear more about your proposal, Mr. Jensen. Marcus finally took a seat. I thought you might. 3 months after the incident, Heather Dawson sat nervously in a small meeting room at the Liberty Airlines Training Center, her hands twisted in her lap as she waited. The door opened, and Marcus Jensen walked in, dressed in a simple dark blue suit. Heather immediately stood up, her face showing a mixture of fear and shame. Mr. Jensen, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Marcus gestured for her to sit back down. How are you doing, Heather? He asked, taking the seat across from her. She looked surprised by the simple, human question. I'm doing better. The program has been, she paused, searching for words, life-changing, actually. For the past 12 weeks, Heather had been part of the pilot group for the new training program that Marcus had created with Liberty Airlines. What started as her worst nightmare, becoming known nationwide as the racist flight attendant, had slowly transformed into something unexpected. I've been following your progress, Marcus said. Your instructors say you've been fully engaged in the process. Heather nodded. At first, I was just going through the motions. I thought this was just punishment, or some PR stunt. She looked directly at Marcus for the first time. But then I started to actually listen, to hear the stories from my black colleagues about what they experience every day. Things I never noticed or thought about. Outside the window, planes took off and landed in the distance. The training center was located near Liberty's main hub, where hundreds of employees were now cycling through the new program. Why did you want to meet with me today? Marcus asked. Heather took a deep breath. 2 reasons. First, I wanted to apologize to you personally, not because you're wealthy or powerful, but because what I did was wrong on a basic human level. I treated you terribly, and there's no excuse for that. Marcus nodded, and the second reason. I want to help expand the program, she said with newfound confidence. I've been talking with the training team about developing a module specifically addressing frontline service staff and the split-second judgments we make about passengers, who we think belongs in first class, who we give extra attention to, who we ignore. Marcus leaned forward, genuinely interested. Go on. I was thinking we could create scenario-based training using virtual reality. Put employees in situations where they have to make quick decisions, then replay those scenarios and analyze the biases that influence their choices. For the next 30 minutes, they discussed her ideas. Heather had clearly given this significant thought, drawing on her 15 years of airline experience and her recent awakening to her own deeply held biases. As their meeting came to a close, Marcus stood up. I think you're onto something important, Heather. I'd like you to present these ideas to the full program team next week. Her eyes widened. Really? You trust me with that? This program isn't about punishment, Marcus replied. It's about transformation, and sometimes the most powerful advocates for change are people who have made mistakes and learned from them. As they walked together toward the exit, they passed a wall of television screens showing news channels. One screen showed Richard Wilson, Liberty's CEO, announcing that the company was extending the training program to all their partnered airlines around the world. 6 months ago, Liberty Airlines made headlines for all the wrong reasons, Wilson was saying to the reporters. Today, we're working to turn that moment of shame into lasting change for our entire industry. Heather stopped walking and stared at the screen. I never thought anything good could come from what I did, she said quietly. That's the thing about mistakes, Marcus replied. They can destroy us, or they can transform us. The choice is ours. As they parted ways in the lobby, Heather asked one final question. Why did you do this? You could have sued the airline for millions. You could have made sure I never worked again. Why choose this path instead? Marcus thought for a moment before answering. Because justice without healing just creates more wounds. And the world already has enough of those. 1 year after the slap that went viral across the world, Marcus Jensen stood on a stage at the National Aviation Conference in Chicago. The audience of over 2,000 airline executives, staff trainers, and industry leaders waited in hushed anticipation. Beside him stood Heather Dawson, looking professional in a navy blue suit, though her nervous fingers adjusting her collar betrayed her anxiety about addressing such a large crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," Marcus began, his deep voice carrying across the silent room. "A year ago, I boarded a flight as just another passenger. What happened that day could have ended with anger, lawsuits, and nothing really changing. Instead, we chose a different path." The large screen behind them displayed statistics from the Liberty Airlines Inclusive Service Initiative, now implemented across their entire global operation. Employee satisfaction was up 23%. Customer complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped by 67%. The airline's public image had transformed from a company in crisis to an industry leader in workplace culture. "I'd like to introduce someone many of you think you already know," Marcus continued. "You've seen her in a viral video. You've read about her in the news. But there's much more to her story." He gestured to Heather. "Please welcome Heather Dawson, who is now Liberty's Director of Inclusive Service Training." The audience's reaction was mixed, some applause, some uncomfortable shifting in seats, some whispers. Heather stepped forward to the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. "A year ago, I did something terrible," she said simply. "I judged a man based on his appearance. I treated him disrespectfully. And then, when he calmly asked to be treated like every other passenger, I slapped him." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It was the worst day of my life, but also the beginning of the most important journey I've ever taken." As Heather spoke about her experience in the training program and her eventual role in expanding it, Marcus watched the audience. Expressions changed from skepticism to interest, and finally to genuine engagement. By the time she finished explaining the new virtual reality training modules she had helped develop, people were taking notes and nodding. "We've now trained over 24,000 airline staff across 6 carriers," Heather concluded. "But we're just getting started. Today, we're announcing that the Inclusive Service Initiative is being made available to every airline worldwide, with funding support from the Jensen Foundation." The applause was thunderous. As Marcus stepped back to the microphone, he saw something that had been rare in his business career: genuine change happening before his eyes. Later that evening, Marcus and Heather sat in the quiet hotel restaurant with David Chen, the businessman who had recorded the original incident and had since become a good friend and advisor to the program. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" David asked, raising his glass in a small toast. Heather shook her head. "Never. When I saw that video of myself," she trailed off, "I didn't recognize the person I had become." "People are calling this a miracle transformation," Marcus said. "But it wasn't a miracle. It was hard work, painful honesty, willingness to change." Their conversation was interrupted by a young black flight attendant who approached their table hesitantly. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, "but I just completed the training program last month, and I wanted to thank you both. For the first time in my career, I feel like someone is addressing what we go through every day." After she left, the 3 sat in thoughtful silence. Finally, Heather spoke. "One bad moment doesn't have to define a life," she said quietly. "That's what I've learned. We can choose to be better tomorrow than we were yesterday." Marcus nodded. "And one good program can change an industry." Outside the window, planes took off into the night sky, carrying thousands of passengers and crew members. Among them were people whose lives would be touched by what had begun with a terrible moment on a routine flight. The slap had echoed far beyond that first-class cabin, but so had the healing that followed. "To second chances," David said, raising his glass again. "And to doing better," Marcus and Heather replied together, completing the toast.